Okay, so we're diving deep today into this CNN interview with Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota.
Yep.
You sent this over.
Today.
And this seems like a really interesting look at how folks are reacting to some of these new economic developments and some political commentary that's come out,
Yeah.
especially with what former Vice President Harris said about, it's that I told you so kind of thing about President Trump's tariffs.
Right.
And how that's affecting the global economy and stuff.
Absolutely. And what's so interesting about this is that it puts this like point of tension out there, right?
Yeah.
You've got Harris on the one hand essentially saying, we told you so about this global destruction that we're seeing. And then you've got folks like Governor Walz,
right,
who are really grappling with the on-the-ground reality of these policies. And,
right.
And so what we're going to do in this deep dive, as you requested, is really get into Governor Walz's perspective on this.
Yeah.
How are these policies impacting key sectors like agriculture and manufacturing in Minnesota?
Yeah.
And then what does that tell us about, like, the bigger picture struggles that the Democratic Party is facing when they're trying to connect with voters on these economic anxieties?
Okay, so So let's start off with agriculture.
Yeah.
Because Governor Walz really emphasizes how important this is to Minnesota's economy.
Absolutely.
I mean, he says, it's a top 5 state nationally when it comes to AG.
Huge ag state.
Yeah, and so his immediate reaction to both Kamala Harris saying this "I told you so" thing and the ag secretary seemingly downplaying these concerns, he says he was stunned.
Yeah, I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah.
You could just feel the tension there in that word stunned, because there's often this real disconnect, right, between like folks who are at the national level having these conversations about trade policy, and then the folks on the ground who are actually feeling the impact of it.
Yeah.
And so you have sectors like agriculture that are export-oriented, and their pain is often really immediate and severe when these trade disputes start.
Right.
But then the benefits that might accrue to domestic manufacturing, let's say, those tend to be more long-term and a lot less certain.
Right.
And so you get this tension, you get these different viewpoints.
Yeah, and he's basically saying that, the national conversation isn't reflecting the reality on the ground for farmers and all the industries that are tied to farming.
Exactly.
And he even mentions specifically Cargill and General Mills.
Right in his district, major employers.
Right, and he uses some pretty strong language.
Yeah.
He calls this idea of just trying out tariffs, this flippant nature of it.
Yeah.
He says it's really dangerous.
Yeah.
It's not like you can just flip a switch, and turn these tariffs on and off.
It takes years
Yeah.
to develop these markets, to build these relationships with dependable trading partners.
Yeah, he talks about that too.
Yeah.
These relationships are super important.
And, if you look back historically, agriculture is almost always the hardest hit sector in any kind of trade war.
Yeah.
They're kind of the first ones to feel the pain.
It's true.
And, when you consider that Minnesota's top export markets are places like Mexico and Canada.
Yeah.
Who Governor Walz specifically calls great friends.
Yeah, he does.
You can really see why he's so concerned about the potential fallout from, messing with these long-standing relationships by using tariffs.
Right, and this idea of stability and predictability is so important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it goes back to this basic idea of comparative advantage.
Yeah.
Right, that countries should specialize in producing the goods and services that they're most efficient at.
Right.
And then trade with each other for mutual benefit.
Right.
Well, tariffs come in and they disrupt that.
Yeah, they do.
They essentially make it more expensive to engage in this kind of mutually beneficial trade.
Yeah.
And that creates all this uncertainty.
Yeah, and he doesn't just talk about it.
No.
He actually says that he's going to call the ag secretary himself to urge him to come see what's going on in Minnesota.
See the reality on the ground.
Yeah, so, I mean, that shows that he's serious.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
He's not just complaining. He's actively trying to bridge this gap in understanding that he sees at the national level.
Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit to manufacturing and the perspective of the UAW, the United Auto Workers Union.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting because
it's a total contrast.
It is. It's a total contrast.
Yeah.
So we have Governor Walz who's talking about all these, really bad things that could happen with agriculture as a result of these tariffs.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you have the UAW saying that actually these tariffs are a good thing.
Right. And in fact, they view these tariffs as a long overdue shift away from this economic model that they believe has really hurt the working class for decades.
Yeah.
And so their argument is that these tariffs are actually helping American workers by prioritizing them over corporate interests.
Yeah, and that's so interesting because Governor Walz would probably agree with the idea that
American manufacturing has been hurt.
Yeah, he doesn't actually disagree with that assessment.
No, not at all.
That manufacturing has been, gutted.
Yeah, gutted was the word that he used.
Yeah, and that outsourcing has been a big problem.
Yeah, over the last 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, and he even acknowledges that people are really feeling this.
Yeah, he talks about this angst that people are feeling.
Yeah, but here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
He doesn't agree with Trump's proposed solution.
Yeah, which is to use tariffs and isolationism to try to fix this problem.
Yeah, he doesn't think that's the answer.
Yeah, this is where it gets really tricky, right? Yeah. Because on the one hand, you have to acknowledge that there's a real problem.
Yeah.
American manufacturing has declined.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you don't want to endorse a solution that might create even more problems.
Right.
And Governor Walz is really trying to walk that tightrope.
Yeah.
He's saying, okay, yeah, there might be some very specific circumstances where tariffs can be helpful.
Right. He says, like, with steel.
Yeah, in certain very specific situations.
Yeah.
Targeted tariffs might be helpful.
Yeah. But
overall, this broad isolationist approach, that's not the answer.
Right. And he gives this really good example of these taconite miners in Minnesota.
Yeah, 650 of them got laid off.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show you how interconnected all of these industries are.
Yeah, because these miners are the ones supplying the steel.
Right, raw materials for the auto industry.
Right.
And so you can have these tariffs that are supposed to be protecting auto workers.
Right.
But then they end up hurting the miners
right.
who supply the steel for the cars.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
Yeah, this is a classic example of those unintended consequences that can happen with economic policy.
Yeah.
You try to target one thing.
Yeah.
But then it ripples out.
Right.
And affects all these other things that you didn't even think about.
Yeah, and this is what Governor Walz calls the democratic dilemma.
Yeah.
Right? They have to acknowledge the problems.
Yeah, the real economic anxieties.
Yeah. That people are feeling.
Yeah.
But they have to offer a better solution.
A better path forward. And then most importantly, they have to actually connect with voters on these issues.
Right. And Governor Walz is pretty straightforward in his assessment of Trump.
Yeah.
He says that Trump has not once ever cared about workers.
Yeah.
And he really emphasizes that, he himself truly believes in unions and living wages and thinks that those are the real solutions.
Yeah, those are his solutions to these problems.
Yeah, right. Okay, so the interview then kind of naturally shifts to the bigger picture.
Yeah, the broader political landscape.
Yeah, and the struggles that the Democratic Party is facing.
Right.
And Walz points out that, Kamala Harris saying, "I told you so," about these tariffs, even if she's right.
Yeah.
Doesn't really matter.
Right. Doesn't really change anything.
Yeah. Doesn't change the fact that people didn't vote for her.
Exactly. And what I thought was so interesting about this part of the interview was Governor Walz's self-awareness.
Yeah. He's willing to own up to some of the mistakes.
Yeah. He's willing to take some responsibility for how things have turned out.
Yeah. He acknowledges some of the criticism of the Harris campaign.
Yeah.
Saying that maybe they were too cautious.
Right.
And he even says, "I own this."
Yeah, I own this.
You know about how the ticket performed?
Yeah. You don't hear that a lot.
No, you don't.
From politicians.
No.
To be so self-reflective.
Yeah. And it leads him to this really fundamental question. Like, why is it that even though Democrats think that, the Republicans are making all these mistakes, especially with the economy, why aren't voters seeing the Democrats as the better choice?
Yeah.
And he's really worried about the voters who are staying home.
Yeah. The ones who aren't even showing up to vote.
Yeah.
And that suggests that there's this real disconnect between the Democratic Party and a lot of voters out there.
Yeah.
And I think what Governor Walz really nails here is that Trump has been really successful at tapping into the anxieties that a lot of voters are feeling.
The economic anxieties.
Yeah, exactly. The worries about housing, the worries about education, the worries about their financial future.
Yeah, he mentions the stat about how less than half of Americans have $1,000 in savings.
Right.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's a really sobering statistic.
Yeah, and Walz didn't hold back from criticizing his own party here.
No.
He says you know, why isn't the Democratic message resonating?
Right.
Why aren't they connecting with voters on these issues?
Yeah.
You know, they talk about caring, about working people,
Right.
about protecting the social safety net,
Yeah.
about improving healthcare.
Yeah.
But why isn't that message getting through?
Right. Why isn't that connecting with voters?
Yeah, and he points out that, you know, Democrats do well in special elections,
Right.
in off-year elections.
Right.
But then they struggle in presidential years.
Yeah.
So maybe there's something about the electorate.
Yeah, where the messaging...
that's different in those big elections.
Maybe it's harder to get your message across.
Yeah.
In those high-stakes elections.
Yeah, and the other thing he talks about is how party lines have really eroded.
Yeah, the old assumptions about who votes for who
Right.
aren't really holding up anymore.
Yeah, like, you know, it used to be that the working class always voted Democrat. And the Republicans were the party of the wealthy.
Yeah, the country club set.
Yeah, but that's not really true anymore.
Not so much anymore.
And he even points to the approval ratings.
Yeah, both parties are really low right now.
Yeah, which tells you that people are just unhappy.
Yeah, they're dissatisfied.
Yeah, with both parties.
Yeah, and they're looking for something different.
Yeah, and then he even addresses this criticism that Democrats have been gaslighting the country.
Right, about things like inflation and the border.
Yeah, and the interviewer really presses him on this.
Yeah.
You know, saying that Democrats are downplaying the concerns.
Yeah, the real anxiety.
Yeah, that voters are feeling.
That people are dealing with every single day.
Yeah, and Governor Walz admits that maybe they've been intellectualizing these issues too much instead of just talking about.
Yeah, the real tangible problems.
Yeah, that people are facing.
The struggles that they're dealing with.
Yeah, you know, putting food on the table.
Yeah.
Finding affordable housing. Worrying about their kids' futures.
Absolutely.
And he says that the soft landing narrative didn't really connect with people.
No, because even if the overall economy was doing okay, people were still feeling the pinch of rising prices.
Yeah, and he says that, you know, even though Biden did achieve this soft landing, and he did navigate COVID, well, Democrats didn't really counter the narratives that were coming from people like Trump.
Yeah, especially on issues like the border.
Yeah.
And so they ended up looking weak.
Yeah.
Or like they didn't care.
Right.
And so he offers some solutions for the border.
Yeah.
You know, investing more.
Yeah.
Having more judges to process these cases.
Right.
Uplifting legal immigrants.
Yeah.
But he admits that it's really hard to get that message across.
Right.
To show people that they genuinely care.
Okay, so here's the big question the interviewer asked. Was supporting Biden for re-election a major mistake?
Big mistake.
And Governor Walz is really honest in his answer.
Yeah, I thought that was so refreshing.
Yeah.
He didn't try to dodge the question.
Yeah.
He just said, you know, history might show that it was a mistake.
Yeah.
And he hopes that the Democrats learn from this.
Yeah, and then he pivots to talking about how worried he is about the direction that the country might take.
Yeah, under a future Trump administration.
Yeah, and he even mentions Trump's comments about nuclear war.
Yeah, it was really striking.
Yeah.
The contrast between talking about tariffs, which seems kind of mundane, and then talking about the possibility of nuclear war, which is obviously a much more serious topic.
Yeah, and this really underscores how concerned he is.
Absolutely. He's feeling a real sense of urgency.
Yeah.
And he's saying that we need a strong opposition party that's actually engaging with the concerns of everyday people.
Right. And so he's saying that he's leaning towards running for governor again in Minnesota.
Yeah, focusing on the immediate challenges.
Yeah, and not on a 2028 presidential run.
Right. Not thinking about his own ambitions.
Right.
But thinking about what's best for the country.
Yeah.
Right now.
Right. And he's very clear about his motivation.
Yeah.
He wants to prevent policies that are hurting people from being enacted by Trump or a successor.
Yeah. So we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
With Governor Walz.
Yeah.
And we've seen the immediate concerns of a key state when it comes to tariffs.
Yeah. Especially for agriculture.
Yeah. The potential impact on agriculture is huge.
Yeah. And then we've also seen the different perspectives within the labor movement.
Yeah. The UAW supporting the tariffs.
Yeah.
While other folks are more skeptical.
Right. And then we've also seen the challenges that the Democratic Party is facing.
Yeah, they're really struggling to connect with voters on these economic anxieties.
Right. And so for you, our listener, you should now have a much better understanding of how people are reacting to these national economic policies.
Yeah, we've heard it straight from a state leader.
Right. And you've also gotten a glimpse into the internal debates that are happening within a major political party.
Yeah, the Democrats are really trying to figure out how to better connect with voters. And understand their economic realities.
Okay, so as we wrap this up, I think the big question we're left with is, what do political parties need to do to really represent the people?
You know, the American electorate. It's a diverse group of people with different needs, different aspirations. And how can the parties actually represent that?
It's a big question.
It is a big question.
But it's one that we need to keep asking.